What in God's name happened to you?
They're coming. You need to get inside.
Late November, 1881. The storm reached Black Alder Creek before dark, driving snow sideways across the Judith Basin. By the time Sadie Harland barred the west shutter, the road had vanished. Sadie was 29 and alone at Harland Ranch. Her father, Wesley, had died in September. His coat still hung from a wooden peg. His mug sat untouched on the shelf. His auger rested on the bench. His chair remained angled toward the stove, as if he might return before supper. She left everything where it was. Outside, the cattle huddled behind the barn wall. The snow wasn't falling. It was being flattened and swept across the ground by the wind ripping off the northwest ridge. Sadie tightened the shutters, twisted wool into the cold gap along the sill, banked the stove, and pulled on her coat. The spring box had been slowing for days. The cattle still needed water. After checking the trough, she was turning back toward the cabin when a horse cried out beyond the fence, sharp and terrified against the storm. Sadie stopped. Then it cried again. No rider with sense should have been out there. Sadie took the lantern from its hook, looped a rope over one shoulder, and pushed back into the storm. The horse stood beyond the cottonwood fence. A bay-roan mare pressed against the rails, with her reins dragging through the snow. She could have run. She had not. A man hung sideways from the saddle, one boot trapped in the stirrup. His left shoulder sagged at a bad angle. Blood had dried black along one trouser leg. His gloves were stiff with ice. Sadie touched his neck. A pulse answered, weak but steady. She could not carry him. She tied the rope around his chest, passed it over the saddle horn, and took some of his weight before freeing the trapped boot. He slid down slowly instead of falling. Wind struck hard. Sadie spread an empty feed sack over a folded piece of canvas, rolled him onto it, and dragged him toward the porch. The mare followed as far as the gate. Sadie opened the barn, led her inside, then returned. Firelight reached across the doorway as she pulled the stranger over the threshold. Fresh blood had now soaked through his trouser leg. The cold was no longer the greatest danger. Sadie cut the frozen cloth away from the stranger's thigh. The wound was deep, but the blood did not pulse. That gave her time. She boiled water, let it cool, then washed away dirt and dried blood without digging into the torn flesh. Clean cloth went over the wound. She pressed until the bleeding slowed, then tied the dressing firmly in place. His left shoulder worried her next. It sat wrong, and any attempt to force it back might do more harm. Sadie folded a strip of wool into a sling and bound the arm against his body. She moved him nearer the stove, but not against it. His soaking wet coat came off. Dry wool and quilts went on. She wrapped heated stones in cloth and placed them near his chest and sides. When he stirred enough to swallow, she gave him warm broth a little at a time. Only then did she pull on her coat again. Brindle was waiting in the barn. Sadie removed the saddle, ran her hands down the mare's legs, found no serious injury, and pushed hay into the manger. Before dawn, the stranger opened his eyes. The mare? Barn. His face loosened. He breathed out and closed his eyes again. Sadie remained beside him until his breathing settled. Then she looked across the stove. Wesley's chair stood empty, turned toward the door, where Sadie had left it after the funeral. For the first time since September, another man was sleeping beneath her father's roof. The storm held Black Alder Creek for 3 days. Snow covered the road, buried the lower fence rails, and left Sadie and the stranger with nowhere to go. By the second morning, he could stay awake long enough to speak. His name was Elias Boone. He was 34, a horse buyer and breaker who had spent years moving between ranches, freight camps, and stockyards. He offered little more unless Sadie asked. She answered the same way. Elias did not need many questions to understand the cabin. One plate remained apart from the others. Wesley's saddle gathered dust in the barn. The ranch ledger stopped for several days after September. When Sadie opened it to count winter expenses, he caught one figure before she closed the book: $31.60. The haystack told him the rest. By then, he had also noticed the loose brace on the north barn wall, the cold slipping through the northwest sill, and the broken latch on the feed chest. His left arm was useless, but his right still worked. He found a scrap of hardwood and carved a new catch with Sadie's knife. When he reached toward Wesley's auger on the bench, his hand stopped. He set it back exactly where it had been. "May I?" Sadie looked at the tool, then at him. She nodded. That evening, she served supper without mentioning the repair. Elias found more broth in his bowl than he had the night before. He noticed that too. Outside, the wind kept pressing at the walls. Inside, neither of them found much reason to fill the silence. The basin remained closed beneath snow, and Elias recovered by degrees. His shoulder still would not bear weight, so he worked around it. With one hand, he replaced the bent lantern hook near the door. He shaved the cracked edge from Sadie's axe handle, whittled a wooden peg for a loose harness strap, and adjusted the door latch until it caught without being lifted. Sadie spent those hours mending tack and dividing the remaining hay by animal and week. They rarely spoke unless the work required it. At night, they sat on opposite sides of the stove. One evening, Elias looked through the window toward the barn. "Why does it sit crooked to the cabin?" "It isn't crooked." He glanced at her. Sadie set down the strap she was stitching. "Wesley had followed the slope when he built the barn," she explained. "The northwest ridge complicated everything. Wind might seem to come straight across the basin, but snow showed where the air slowed, curled, and dropped what it carried." She pointed toward a pale ridge forming beyond the corral. "Snow tells more truth than wind does." Elias said nothing. He rose, crossed to the window, and watched the drifting line. He studied where snow gathered behind the fence and where ground remained bare. Then he returned to his chair and picked up wood he had been shaping. Sadie went back to her stitching. The stove settled between them. Silence inside the cabin did not feel like something that needed fixing. On the fourth morning, the wind dropped. Blue showed between broken clouds, and the Judith Basin began to appear beneath the white. Elias tested his shoulder before breakfast. It still hurt, but he could hold the reins. "The pass may look open before it is," Sadie said. "I know." He had horses promised along the Fort Benton route. A buyer was waiting, and waiting men eventually bought elsewhere. Sadie understood that kind of obligation. She did not ask him to stay. Elias saddled Brindle slowly, working mostly with his right hand. Before mounting, he crossed to the barn and drove a second spike beside the loose north brace. It tightened the timber, but only for the moment. "That brace needs more than one nail." "I know." There was nothing else to settle. Elias mounted. Brindle stepped through the gate and turned toward the basin road. Sadie stood in the doorway until horse and rider became a dark shape against the snow. He never looked back. She went inside before the shape disappeared. Later, while checking the barn, Sadie found the hammer Elias had used. He had returned it to the same place. Wesley always kept it, beside the auger on the workbench. Sadie stood there for a moment. Then she picked up the hammer and moved it to the other end of the bench. The ranch became quiet again. Nothing important had changed. There were still cattle to feed, ice to break, wood to cut, and fences buried beneath snow. Yet Elias had left small changes behind him. The lantern stayed straight on its new hook. The axe handle no longer rubbed Sadie's palm raw. The feed chest closed with one push. A harness strap that used to fall behind the bench now hung from a wooden peg. Each repair saved only seconds. Together, they made his absence harder to ignore. One evening, Sadie lifted the stew pot from the stove and filled a bowl. Without thinking, she reached for another. She filled that one too. Her hand stopped. Steam rose between the two bowls, while the fire cracked behind her. Sadie poured the second serving back into the pot. She washed the bowl, dried it, and placed it on the shelf above the others. Morning came cold. Work answered it. She chopped ice from the trough and checked the thin flow from the spring box. She measured the haystack again, then reduced the cattle ration slightly. Deadfall came down from the cottonwoods by rope. Pregnant cows were checked twice each day. Every new drift near the barn approach had to be cut down before wind packed it hard. Her gloves split at the fingers. The old draft mare needed extra feed. The north brace creaked whenever the wind strengthened. Winter had no interest in who had stayed or who had gone. By dusk, Sadie was outside again, shovel in hand, clearing another ridge of snow from the barn door. Behind her, through the cabin window, one clean bowl remained alone on the upper shelf. January was hard. February was worse. Cold settled over Black Alder Creek and stayed there. The spring-fed trough narrowed each morning until only a thin ribbon of water moved beneath the ice. Sadie opened the wooden box section, chopped away ice, and cleared the inlet. She packed fresh straw around the exposed wood, covered it with earth, then brought the cattle forward in small groups. Too many at once would empty the trough faster than the spring could refill it. Then one calf went down. Sadie found it trembling in the barn. She moved it to the corner with the least draft, spread dry hay beneath it, and covered its back with an old wool blanket. That evening, the north wall groaned. The brace Elias had warned about had loosened again. Sadie cut a cottonwood pole, set it diagonally against the frame, and drove an iron spike home. The work was rough. It only had to hold. After midnight, the wind shifted. Cold air began cutting across the calf's corner. Sadie hung a reed mat between two posts, blocking the low draft while leaving an opening above it. The barn still needed to breathe. Closing everything tight would trap damp air around the animals. She checked the calf twice before dawn. At sunrise, it pushed its front legs beneath itself. Then it stood. Sadie watched long enough to see it reach its mother. She pulled away the wool blanket, carried it outside, and hung it over the fence to dry. There was still ice to break. By the end of March, winter began releasing the lower meadow. Snow withdrew first from the south-facing ground, leaving dark strips of grass along the slopes. Black Alder Creek grew louder each afternoon as meltwater came down from the ridges. Sadie began finding work that did not require mittens. She sat outside the barn repairing harness in the sunlight. The cattle spread farther across the meadow. Mud replaced packed snow around the corral, and water moved through places that had been frozen solid for months. Near the barn, runoff collected in a shallow depression beside the covered water conduit. Sadie noticed it before noon. She cut several willow switches and pushed them into the ground to mark the wet edges. The soil around the buried box was holding more moisture than she liked. It would need attention once the ground dried enough to dig. For now, she watched where the water traveled. A few days later, Sadie found the first prairie crocus opening on a sunny bank. She cut several stems and carried them home in one hand. Inside the cabin, she opened the east window a few inches. Cool air moved through the room without the hard bite of winter. Sadie filled a small jar with water and set the flowers inside. For months, one clean bowl had remained on the upper shelf where she had placed it after Elias left. She moved it aside. Then she set the jar in its place, where the morning light could reach it. By early April, the basin road had begun to show through the last dirty banks of snow. Sadie sat outside the barn with a breast strap across her knees, pushing an awl through stiff leather. Black Alder Creek rushed with more force behind the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the bottomland, water dripped endlessly from a shadowed bank. Then came hoofbeats. She kept working. One horse could belong to a neighbor passing through. Then a second rhythm followed it. A third came behind, slower under a load. Sadie stopped the awl halfway through the leather. The first shape to appear on the basin road was Brindle. The mare that had once carried Elias Boone here half frozen and bleeding was now bringing him back. This time he rode tall in the saddle. He was leaner than he had been in November, his face darkened by months of sun and wind. His left shoulder moved freely now. Behind Brindle came a stout dun mare, then a pack horse carrying canvas rolls and bundled supplies. Elias reached the gate and stopped outside it. He did not open it himself. Sadie rose, still holding the awl. For several seconds, neither spoke. "The road opened yesterday," Elias said. "You rode fast." His eyes shifted briefly toward the barn. He did not answer. Sadie looked past him. Heavy canvas was tied behind the pack saddle. She saw iron strap, an auger bit, a crosscut saw, sacks of salt and coffee, and a smaller bag of seed grain. Then she studied the dun mare. Broad chest, strong legs, calm eyes. A working animal, chosen carefully. Whose mare? Elias rested one hand on the saddle horn. Yours, if you'll have her. Sadie looked at the mare again, then back at Elias. No, he waited. I can't pay for her. I'm not selling her. That makes it worse. Elias said nothing. Sadie lowered the awl to her side. I don't take charity. His eyes moved across the ranch. The north barn wall had a new diagonal brace. Fresh earth covered part of the water line. Fence rails had been reset along the meadow. The place was worn, but it had not been waiting for him. You kept me alive, he said. I remembered what needed doing. The debt was paid when you rode out alive. That stopped him. Wind moved lightly through the cottonwoods. Brindle lowered her head beside the gate. Elias looked toward the canvas and tools on the pack horse, then at the dun mare. All right. Sadie waited. I need board for a few weeks, he said. The mare can cover part of it. Supplies cover the rest. I work while I'm here. For wages? For meals and a place to sleep. Sadie studied him long enough that the dun mare shifted one hind foot. This was different. Not rescue. Not repayment. Work could be measured. So could feed, lodging, tools, and horseflesh. And when the work is even? Then you tell me. Sadie looked at the barn, the sagging gate beyond it, and the willow stakes beside the wet ground. There was more work than either of them could finish quickly. She walked to the gate. Elias remained where he was. Sadie lifted the wooden latch and pulled the gate inward. Only then did Brindle step onto Harland Ranch. She stepped aside and left room for all three horses. Elias stayed. They began with the work closest at hand. The north barn brace came first. Then the sagging gate, the creek crossing, and a broken fence section along the lower meadow. None of it changed the ranch at once. Each repair simply removed one problem from tomorrow. While working near the barn, Elias began studying the northwest side. The ridge sent winter wind almost straight toward the livestock wall. He proposed a windbreak 27 feet out, built from cottonwood poles woven tightly with willow. Sadie looked toward the ridge. Too tight. It's far enough from the barn. The snow won't care. Elias rested his hand on a post. Sadie did not argue further. We'll see after the next snow. So they built the first section his way. Meanwhile, days found a rhythm. Sadie rode the meadow and checked cattle while Elias split poles. They repaired fence together in the afternoon. At dusk, tools were cleaned and returned to the bench. Some evenings they sat near the stove. On warmer nights they used the porch. Elias spoke about freight roads, stockyards, bad horses, and camps that disappeared when the work moved on. Sadie told him where Black Alder Creek flooded, which slopes dried first, and where winter wind left bare ground beneath deep snow. 1 week became 2. Neither mentioned the agreement. Each night, Elias rolled his bed beside the same cabin wall. His spare clothes remained inside the pack. His bedroll always returned to the same corner. But he never unpacked it completely. Sadie noticed. She never asked why. The answer came before April was finished. A late snow crossed the Judith Basin after dark. It was not a dangerous storm. By morning, only several inches covered the meadow. It was enough. Elias stepped outside and stopped. The new barrier had broken the direct wind, just as he expected. But along its edge, the air had curled hard around the tight willow weave. Snow had followed it. A thick drift curved toward the livestock gate. Sadie walked past him carrying willow stakes. She pushed one into the highest part of the drift, then another where the snow began to thin. She said nothing. Elias walked the full length of the barrier. He studied the bare ground on the windward side, the heavy deposit behind it, and the curved ridge reaching toward the gate. Then he fetched his tools. He began removing willow. Together they opened gaps through the woven sections. They changed the angle of the outer end and extended it farther from the barn while keeping the main barrier about 27 feet away. Elias watched Sadie choose the next post position. "You're not trying to stop it," he said. Sadie looked toward the ridge. Wind doesn't stop. She pointed at the open ground between the barrier and barn. You make it spend itself before it gets there. Elias looked again at the drift his tighter wall had made. Snow had settled the argument overnight. He picked up the hammer. For a moment, Sadie expected him to drive the next post himself. Instead, Elias held the hammer out to her. Sadie took it. He moved aside while she marked where the next post would go. The spring thaw exposed another problem. During the worst cold in February, Sadie had piled extra earth over a low section of the wooden water conduit. It had helped keep the flow from freezing. Now that same ground stayed wet. Runoff collected beside the trench and soaked into the packed bedding around the wooden box. Within days, one edge began to slump. Sadie studied it with a shovel in hand. It needs to go deeper. Elias crouched beside the trench and looked toward the spring. Then he followed the grade with his eyes. Depth isn't the problem. He pushed the shovel into the wet earth. Water gathered almost immediately. It had nowhere to show. It had nowhere to drain. When they dug the trench open, mud was pressing hard against the conduit from both sides. Elias proposed a different fix. They cut a shallow bypass channel for runoff, laid coarse gravel beneath the low section, and raised the wooden box slightly to restore an even fall. At the access point, they fitted a removable lid so the channel could be cleared without digging it open again. Sadie worked without complaint, though every shovel of earth removed work she had done only weeks earlier. By afternoon, water was draining away from the conduit instead of collecting around it. She looked down at the rebuilt section. I hated doing that twice. Elias tamped gravel beside the box. Better April than January. Sadie tried to hold her expression. She failed. Elias looked up. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. Through May and June, separate repairs began working as one system. The windbreak grew along the northwest side of the barn. Cottonwood posts held split willow, but the weave remained open enough for air to pass through. The barrier stood away from the building, where moving air could lose force before reaching the livestock. Inside, Sadie and Elias improved the calf corner. Reed mats and bunchgrass formed a second inner skin against low drafts. They left the upper section open so damp air could escape. The spring-fed water line received straw and reed insulation, earth cover, drainage beneath its lowest section, and removable access points. They repaired the corral, rebuilt the creek crossing, reset meadow fence, and worked the dun mare until she handled cattle without fighting the rains. Harland Ranch still looked worn. It no longer looked neglected. One afternoon, Caleb Dern rode in from his place, 8 miles away. The older rancher had worked cattle in the basin long enough to trust what had worked before. He stopped beside the windbreak. Caleb studied the gaps between the willow strips and laughed. You left half the wind in it. Sadie leaned against a post. That's the half we wanted. Caleb shook his head and rode on. Elias watched him disappear toward the creek. You want me to close it tighter so people quit talking? Sadie looked at the open weave, then at the bare ground between the barrier and barn. No, there was nothing more to discuss. Caleb had his opinion. The windbreak had not yet seen a Montana winter. When it did, opinion would matter very little. By late June, people in the settlement knew Elias had stayed at Harland Ranch longer than a few weeks. Lenora Pike, a prominent figure in the local women's church circle, found Sadie outside the general store. She spoke quietly. A woman alone could lose a good name faster than she could earn it back, Lenora warned. A man sleeping under the same roof gave people something to discuss. Sadie let her finish. Then she went inside. Orville Beck, the storekeeper, had carried the Harland account through lean months before, expecting payment after cattle sales. This time, he pushed the ledger across the counter. I'll need this settled sooner. He offered no insult. He did not mention Elias. He did not have to. Warren Pell arrived while Sadie was checking the figures. The cattle buyer had heard enough to believe she needed money. He offered a low price for several head. Sadie refused. Pell raised it slightly. She refused again. Elias stood near the supply sacks, close enough to hear every word. He stayed there. Pell glanced toward him. You may not have much choice by fall. Sadie closed the ledger. Then come back in fall. She paid for salt and left the rest. On the ride home, Elias kept Brindle beside Sadie's mare. For several miles, neither spoke. The ranch appeared ahead, its windbreak dark against the summer grass. Elias finally looked at her. "You want me gone?" Sadie kept her eyes on the road. She did not answer. That late afternoon, they sat on the porch after the cattle settled. Sadie told Elias what Lenora had said. She told him about Beck shortening the account and Pell trying to use the rumor against her. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked across the yard. "I can leave." Sadie said nothing. "If me being here costs you business, I can move on tomorrow." The words settled between them. Sadie looked toward the barn. The repaired north wall stood firm. Beyond it, the willow windbreak crossed the northwest side of the yard with daylight showing through its gaps. The dun mare grazed near the corral. Farther down, Black Alder Creek caught the last light. All winter, Sadie had kept the ranch alive alone. She knew she could do it again. That was not the question anymore. No. Elias turned toward her. "No, what?" Sadie kept looking across the pasture. "No, I don't want you gone." Elias did not reach for her. He did not ask what she meant beyond the words she had given him. He only nodded. After a while, Sadie mentioned the hay meadow. They were still short of what they wanted before winter. Elias said the windbreak needed several more posts. The water line needed a second access hatch before the ground froze again. They talked until the light left the basin. Later, Elias spread his bedroll in its usual corner. Then he opened the pack that had remained tied shut since April. He took out his spare shirt, folded it once, and placed it inside the small wooden chest near the wall. His extra socks followed, then his shaving kit. Sadie saw him do it from the stove. She turned back to the kettle. Neither of them said anything. For the first time since returning to Black Alder Creek, Elias left the empty pack folded beside the chest. By late November, nearly a year had passed since Brindle first carried Elias Boone through the storm. The warning came before the snow. The horses grew restless. Wind shifted north and stayed there. Thin ice along Black Alder Creek thickened between morning and noon. By afternoon, the upper ridge disappeared behind a gray wall. Sadie knew what was coming. She and Elias worked quickly. They tightened the willow lashings on the windbreak. Elias cleared both access points along the water conduit. Sadie checked the upper opening above the calf section and moved two weaker calves behind the reed barrier. Before dark, they stretched a rope between the cabin and barn. Then the blizzard struck. Wind hammered the basin. Snow raced across the ground. The temperature fell. A willow section snapped. Elias reached for his coat. "I'll replace it." Sadie caught his arm. "Leave it." Another gust shook the barn. "The rest is holding." The broken section could wait. Water could not. They followed the rope to the conduit. One access lid had frozen shut. Elias drove the edge of a hatchet beneath it while Sadie cleared packed snow from the outlet. The lid broke free. Water still moved below. Thin, slow, moving. They returned to the barn as another gust hit. The wall groaned. The calves remained behind the low reed barrier, protected from the direct draft, while damp air escaped above them. Sadie pulled open the barn door and looked outside. Snow had piled deep against the windward side of the willow barrier. Beyond it, the drift spread across open ground. But between the windbreak and barn, the livestock approach remained passable. The gate was still clear. The barn door could still open. One panel was broken. One access lid had frozen. Nothing had worked perfectly. It did not need to. What Caleb Dern had called half a wall was doing exactly what Sadie had intended. The wind had not been stopped. It had spent itself somewhere else. The storm continued into the night. Then something struck the outer gate. Once. Again. Elias lifted the lantern. Sadie took the rope. They followed the line through blowing snow until a horse appeared beyond the gate, head low and sides heaving. Caleb Dern was leading it. Naomi Dern, his wife, sagged in the saddle beneath a snow-covered coat. Sadie opened the gate. There was no time for questions. They brought Naomi inside, wrapped her in dry wool, and gave her warm broth. Caleb stayed near the stove only long enough to feel his hands again. His solid plank wind wall had stopped the wind. It had also stopped the snow. A deep drift had formed close behind it, burying much of his barn approach and nearly cutting his cattle off from water. Caleb had not lost his herd, but he could no longer keep the access open alone. By morning the storm weakened. Caleb walked outside with Elias and Sadie. He saw where snow had collected beyond the Harland windbreak. Instead of against the barn, he saw the clear livestock approach. Inside, the calf section remained dry enough to bed animals while moisture escaped through the opening above. At the conduit, Elias lifted the access cover. Water still trickled through the wooden channel. Caleb said nothing. He walked to the windbreak. Then he began counting his steps toward the barn. When he reached the wall, he turned. 27 feet? Sadie looked across the yard. Near enough. Caleb walked back to the barrier. He put one hand against the split willow and looked through the openings he had laughed at months earlier. Beyond them lay the heavy drift. Behind him stood an open barn door. He ran his fingers along one of the gaps. No apology followed. None was needed. When a practical man began asking for measurements, the argument was already over. Winter did not end with the storm. A fence section still needed repair. Hay remained tight. The stove consumed wood daily, and someone checked the water access every morning. Harland Ranch had survived. It had not become easy. Before the ground froze solid, Elias hauled in a small wagon of lumber. He stacked the boards beside the cabin and covered them with canvas. One morning he stood at the east wall, studying the ground beneath the window. When it thaws, I could set a sill here. Sadie looked outside. A room? One. He paused. If I build it, I'd rather build it as your husband than your hired hand. There was no kneeling, no speech prepared for the moment. Sadie studied the east ground where morning sunlight reached first. Then square the foundation before you start. They married quietly. Reverend Asa Whitcomb performed the ceremony. Caleb and Naomi Dern stood as witnesses. Winter remained outside. Weeks later, another storm crossed Judith Basin. Sadie banked the stove before bed. She checked the shutter and ran her fingers along the northwest sill for cold air. 2 coats hung beside the door now. Elias's gloves dried from a peg beneath the rope. Sadie's hat rested above them. Outside, wind moved through the willow barrier. Water still required watching. The barn still needed repairs. A year earlier, Brindle had carried a dying stranger to that doorway. By spring, he had ridden back because he chose to. Now winter had returned and judged what they had built together. Elias crossed the room and nudged a piece of wood closer to the hearth with his boot. Sadie poured coffee into one mug, then another. She placed the second on the table. This time, she did not put it away.